Hello, my name is Bill Such, and I will be taking this course on the general epistles, and I look forward to your participation in it. I've taught in England, Scotland, and New Zealand, and Africa, and in the US here in California. My expertise is in New Testament, and I'm constructing this syllabus in a different way from what I have in the past. So I'll put the first month up, and then I'll construct it as we go along from there. So in one sense, it will be an open syllabus, and we'll see how we go along. Basically, what I want to do initially at this stage is just to introduce the course to you, introduce myself, and set you up with the first week on what you're to do. The two textbooks that I've already sent you, and I hope that by now that you've gone off to Amazon or some means in which you can get hopefully a used copy of these books, as I have, so that then you are able to read them ahead of time so that we can hit the ground running, because that's very important when we start this course next week. The two textbooks will balance each other. One is first by Karen Jobs out of Wheaton College, is a very readable book, and it covers the whole book covers our course on the general epistles. And then the other book by Moo and Don Carson is much more specific, much more, in a sense, scholarly. It will introduce you to different ideas on the subjects that we study. So you'll be able to work between both of these views and get an idea of the general terrain by Job's works, and then move into specific details in respect to the way that Moo and Carson bring out different authors and different ideas from the text that you can work with in conjunction with the other element, which is I've put up in the syllabus the Wikipedia sites from the epistle to James and Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John and Jude, which I think you also need to use as a resource. It's very good material to give you an overview of such things as thematic elements, content, outline, and so forth. That will be indispensable to really cracking open the material that's in these textbooks. But before we get to that, I think what you need to do is to be familiar with the material that's actually within the text itself. So to do that, I'm going to help you. And what's going to happen is that in every, I think it's every second week, we begin in the first week on this, is that I'm going to give you a test. And the test is really a recollection test that you have to submit by the end of the week, where I give you X number of questions. The first test this week, well, excuse me, next week when the course starts, by the end of the week, you'll have to answer 50 questions. And the 50 questions are simply a way of you perusing through a text and finding answers in the text. So basically, it's a way of getting you into the text in itself and finding out the specific answers within the text. It doesn't really require you to think in the sense of putting forward thematic elements within a text or assessing what who the author is or anything like that. It's really to give you a knowledge of what the text says. Many years ago, when I was in your position studying in a university in New Zealand, one of the problems that came out was that we were so busy studying all the commentaries that somebody put up in the notice board in the Faculty of Theology that it might be a good idea to study the text so that we could understand all the textual commentaries by the theologians, which was, of course, a joke, but it's speaking about a very truthful principle, which is that you have to know the text first before you can actually try and interpret it and weigh up different opinions and different views on what people are saying. So that's my method to get you into the text, is to give you a test every second week, simply in terms of knowing what the text says. So that's what I will do, and that's how we will start. Um, so basically, that's the main element or part of sort of half of your responsibilities. The other will be to give you to be doing essays. And I think it's about 7 essays you have. I'm not giving you an essay every week. I'm giving you an essay, I think, every second week. And the essay will be for 2,000 words. And what that means is that I'm sometimes in the past, I'm I find students, if you write an essay of 750 words or 1,000 words, you don't really get a chance to actually say anything. So with 2,000 words and having to produce it in 2 weeks, then that means you have an opportunity to do some real research. You've got the Wikipedia material to look through. I'll give you the question, the essay question, and then you've got the material in Wikipedia to look through and to research it there. You've got the material in the 2 textbooks that you can work through. And then I'm also going to ask you to cite 2 other sources that you can get online, and be judicious about that. I'm looking for academic sources. I'm not looking for some kind of populistic source that you get from just Googling something that somebody says from a Bible class or a church sermons source. It's got to be a scholarly source. And at your stage at university, you should be able to recognize the difference between a scholarly source and a source that just basically comes down from somebody who's preaching in a church, or it's some sort of a Bible class. And the danger is in what we're doing. You, I presume, wouldn't get this in other subjects like English or in chemistry, but in theology, because it's, quote, church and the Bible and so on, then you can just go online and find something that says something about the book of James that could be from anywhere and use that as a source. No, don't do that. Make sure that the source is of value. Check who the author is, what his or her credentials are, that it's relevant to the question that's been asked, but use 2 external sources as well as the 3 sources that I've just mentioned, which is Wikipedia and the 2 books, the textbooks and the course. And make sure when you write the essay that you do it on a format that's APA or MLA. You make sure that we have a bibliography, and of course, and I'll put up some introduction material on how to write an essay for you. We want an introduction, points where you establish your thesis in the introduction, and then you main body of your paper is to establish what you want to say, and then in the conclusion where you do an assessment or the implications of what you've established and so forth. It's a formal paper is what we're looking for. All right. So you'll read this and see this within the syllabus. The idea of the general epistles, and I've included as Jobsters here Hebrews within this. The general epistles, if you look in the New Testament, they're sort of shunted towards the back. General, they used to be called Catholic epistles, not meaning Roman Catholic epistles, but the idea of Catholic meaning universal. In other words, they're not specifically written to a congregation, as in Paul writing to the Corinthians, which was a city on the Greek mainland, Corinth, or you're writing to Philippi or something like that. They're general. They're for example, Hebrews, if you just read the first few verses of Hebrews, you can see that it's not written to a particular group of people in a specific place. So in that sense, that they're Catholic, they're general, they're universal. Although I want to qualify that, because if you read Third John, it does seem to be written to a particular individual. But in a general way, as a whole, the way that we categorize them is to say that they're different. Let's put it that way to start with. They're different from the Pauline epistles, and epistle means letter. So we're talking about letters that are sent out. And what are we talking about? Well, by the end of the 4th century, we know that the 27 books of the New Testament were brought together and were recognized as such, as the canon of the New Testament. The canon of the New Testament is understood in two ways. That's canon, meaning the list of which books were accounted as being authoritative. 27 books. You go down, and these are the books that are recognized as being inspired by God and recognized by the church. That's one definition of canon. Another definition of canon is not just the list of books, but the fact that the canon is the measuring rod. In other words, these books are the measuring rod in which you weigh up all other books that claim to be inspired by God. So if you come across a book in the 2nd century, the Acts of Peter or the Acts of Paul, then the church says, well, that those books are useful books, but they're not inspired like the books that are in what we call the New Testament. All right. So we have then what? Well, we have the 4 Gospels, and then we have the book of Acts, and then we have Paul's letters, and then we get to the general epistles, prefaced by Hebrews. You can see there's a sort of method in that, but how was it put together? Well, because when you think about it, I'm talking very general terms to give you a very simple introduction to all this, is to say that it was put together as a whole, as a canon, I suppose, from the standpoint of, well, Jesus was Jewish, and Matthew's was traditionally, he was a Jew, and his book is written to Jewish people. And so, therefore, that's where it begins, because it also connects, when it's put together with the Jewish scriptures, with the Old Testament, it's the next connective part that goes from the Old Testament into the, quote, New Testament. It begins there. And then so we have Matthew, and then we have Mark, which is very similar, but is written to a Gentile audience, a non-Jewish audience. And then Luke, they're together, the 3 of them together, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. They call the synoptic gospels. Synoptic means that they are seen alike. They're very, very similar. We're not going to be studying them. All you need to know is that. And then, of course, the 4th gospel is John's gospel. When I was a boy in England, we would say, I would learn in a Bible class, I think it was in the Anglican Church, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John went to bed with their trousers on. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. That's how I learned the 4 Gospels. Anyway, and then, of course, the 4 Gospels are there, and then what do you have next? Well, you have the book of Acts. The book of Acts works because, well, you think the ministry of Jesus, and then the next thing that happened after his resurrection is that the early church then began with Jesus' followers, and from Jerusalem, the Jesus followers began to expand from Jerusalem into Judea, Samaria, and then out into the Asia Minor and the Greek world, and so on to Rome and Spain, etc. And so the book of Acts covers much of that, actually. It covers from Jerusalem in its beginning right through to Rome, the end of the book of Acts in chapter 28. So, and then that would make sense from there that Paul's work would be mentioned, because Paul's work is mentioned right from chapters 13 through the end of the book of Acts. So all the, or many of the situations that Paul went through as he worked and spread the gospel in modern day Turkey, and then on the Greek mainland, the letters to the Corinthians and so forth, the Romans, the Thessalonians, Galatians, Ephesians, they're all mentioned then, of course, in the New Testament canon. So you can see then the structure of it, and finally, then we get to the general epistles that are lumped together, and then finally, of course, you've got the Book of Revelation. Now that's looking at it from a canonical perspective, but when we're going to look at it differently. Of course, we're going to look at it. Actually, we'll look at it in 2 ways. We're going to look at it in the text itself to see what's being said there, and we're going to use the rigors of what's called reader response criticism, or trying to understand the text as a complete whole by itself. That's one method. It's called a synchronic method. And then another method we'll look at, the other method primarily, is what's called a diachronic method, which means that we'll look through the text to see whether there are historical circumstances that will help us to understand the text in a better way. So there's two ways of looking at it in a general form at this point. Just looking at the text by itself and not needing anything else to see what it means, as opposed to looking for hints in the text or historical events which might help us to understand where this document was situated, who it was written to, by whom, and what the meaning of the text was. Because essentially now, if I can break that down and get away from the idea of canon and move into, in a general way, and I'm just giving you material here from Karen Job's book in the first introductory chapter, where she divides the period that we're talking about between into three parts. The first part is the ministry of Jesus, right from the beginning up to 33 AD, the year of our Lord, or as it's known now, CE, the Christian era, where there were no books that were written at all. Jesus didn't write anything down, so we don't have to be concerned about that. But of course, that's where all the, quote, action was of what was going on. But then the second period is very important for us, because the second period is from 33 to 60, which basically was the expansion of the church from Jerusalem out towards Rome and further afield. And it's in this period that we have the oral tradition. That means the story of Jesus that was taken and spread by word of mouth, and eventually was written down in narrative form in terms of the Gospels, and before that, written down by people like Paul, who didn't write down the Gospel, but what he did was he interpreted the Gospel. The Gospel is the good news, and the good news primarily is that Jesus Christ has been crucified and has died for your sins and has been raised from the dead. And therefore, when Paul preached that message, then when he left that area, went and preached somewhere else, he wrote to that congregation that he'd preached the gospel to. And then the letters that he wrote then are very important, because they're the first indication for us of the material that's written down that we can look at and say, now this is what we've got. Now you say, well, why is that important? Well, it's important for a number of reasons. One, it gives us an insight into where they were going. In other words, where they went from Jerusalem, from southern Palestine, of where Jesus was in Galilee and Jerusalem and so forth, and also gives an idea of what is it that they were? What were their main problems? What did they have to deal with? Well, we see from the book of Acts and Paul's letters that the kind of difficult situations that Paul went through when he was traveling throughout the Roman world, and also the kind of problems that occurred when the message initially was a Jewish message about Christ. The Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, well, actually, they didn't see themselves as Christians at all. They saw themselves as Jews who had found the Messiah, a different kind of Messiah than what they actually thought, presumably, before they encountered Jesus. But they were the cat's whiskers, or else, because they thought, well, we've found who the Messiah is now, and so they were elated. But it soon became obvious that the Messiah and the message of the Messiah was not just for Jews alone. It was for others. It was for Gentiles. And then you have the great conflict that went on in the early church between Jews and Gentiles. In other words, did Gentiles, non-Jewish people in places like Corinth and Antioch in Syria, did they have to become circumcised to become followers of this this person Jesus? And so that's why that period is very, very important, because it shows some of the issues that would come out. And we'll see this when we look at the general epistles to see what were the issues that were there. Now, I'm saying that to say uh, from 60 through to the end of the first century, other issues came out that were very important. And Karen Jobes brings out three that are absolutely fundamental to understanding the general epistles. The three that she brings out are primarily persecution, and what needs to be addressed here, that you need to be aware of, is the persecution that occurred in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, by Domitian, a Roman emperor in the early mid 80s, and then the implications of that. For example, I want to say it seems like First and Second Peter are written in a context out of that. So the idea there is that persecution of Christians is going on, and it's by secular authorities. I should say pagan authorities, non-Christian, non-Jewish authorities, although there is still persecution by Jewish authorities going on in different places. But so, in other words, persecution is important. It's found in First and Second Peter. And the second thing is heresy. Now, by heresy, I mean uh, the more the message spreads, the more it comes into contact with ideas other than ideas that were sympathetic or in line with Jewish ideas that existed within Jerusalem, or the common complex of ideas in Judea at the time of Jesus. For example, as they go into the Gentile world, the non-Jewish world in Asia Minor, they come across Greek ideas. Paul in Acts 17 comes across Greek ideas in Athens, according to Luke, where he preaches about Jesus being raised from the dead, and the Athenians, who have Greek notions that go back to people like Plato and Socrates, where the idea of matter, in other words, the resurrection of a body from the dead, it seems somewhat whimsical, because that that would not be something that they would cater to, that on a level of being would be counted as something that anybody would want. Their idea of what would be the most intellectually fathomable, or what we might call spiritual, would be a being that is pure spirit, invisible, indivisible, and not be material at all. That's what we might call an ideology. And so when Paul comes in with the resurrection of the body, it's too crass. Now, the way I explain that very, very briefly as an aside is, in today's world, it's the other way around. In the 21st century, what holds people together is I use the word ideology, philosophy, way of thinking, universally, is the notion of materialism. Materialism is such that by materialism, I'm not talking about consumerism. I'm talking about the fact that the only thing that exists is this material world, and there is no spiritual world. There's no other world where God is and Jesus is, and there's demons and angels and so forth. No afterlife. All that exists is this world now. So we've got the opposite position there. We've got the job, so to speak, of convincing people that there is more to life than this life here. So you see how the interplay between ideas that come out of the text that determine who we are based upon philosophical, theological ideas, and the ideas that society has that impinge upon us that shape how we express the ideas that are in the text. That was going on right from the beginning, and from 60 through the end of the first century, that was especially prominent when the apostles were being persecuted and were dying off. Who was going to tell us what was important, what was orthodox, right belief, what was not, what is heretical, what is wrong belief? And so the idea then that you'll see this in Peter, when Peter says we respect the letters that come from Paul, because Paul is somebody who speaks with authority. Now, was he saying that because he had people around him who were deriding Paul, or were playing Paul off against him, Peter? And Peter was bringing Paul together with himself in terms of establishing an authority. In other words, the authority was being challenged. In John's first letter, we have a situation where people were somehow believing that Jesus was the Messiah, or the Christ, but that he didn't actually walk on the earth. He didn't appear as a human being. And John is saying, they've left us. They've gone their own way. This is heresy. This is not Christianity. So you can see the issues that were arising. All that I'm getting out of the text, or rather, I'm actually getting out of the text just from the way that Karen Jobes in talking about this third period from 60 to 100, when she outlines the issues that are coming out there. We're going to see these issues in the text that we're reading about. We're going to see the issues of heresy in First John, as I've said, and in Third John, and also in I've forgotten the book I was going to mention. Jude, that was it. Jude. All right, and then and the final thing, I just mentioned it. So the three elements were heresy and persecution, and the third one was the apostles dying off. Then those things were instrumental in being sort of elements that produce the works that we know as the general epistles. Now, all right, that's enough as an introduction. The last thing I want to say is that the task in the first week, apart from just introducing yourself, which is to state a couple of paragraphs about you and who you are, why you're taking this course, and what you hope to get out of it, I want you to write an outline of a one-page outline, one page of Hebrews, James, First Peter, First John. That's 4 you have. That will mean that the assignment is simply 4 pages, and it's an outline of each book. Now, it's a one-page outline. It's very simple, and the way to do this is and I'm going to show you how to do it, because I'm going to do the outline of Jude right now to show you. The purpose of it is to get you into reading the material, which is you'll have to read all the literature. You'll have to read all of Hebrews. You'll have to read all of James. You'll have to read first letter of Peter and the first letter of John. So in doing that, and of course the hardest one, so to speak, well, actually would be 13 chapters of Hebrews. How can you do a one-page outline of 13 chapters? Well, you look for the big picture. You don't get lost in chapter 1 and so forth. you're looking at the big picture, and you've got lots of helps. You could look at the outline that's in Karen Job's book on these books. You could compare it with the outline of Moo and Carson, and you could compare that with the outline that's in the Wikipedia. And then the worst thing you could do would be not to read any of the stuff of the raw materials of the books and go straight to these books and work out an outline by just juggling the pieces and then just putting them on a piece of paper. That's the way you cheat. You don't learn anything. You do it the proper way is to read the text, to read all that, and then work it out yourself, and then compare it with these others, and maybe that causes you to adjust one or two things. I'm asking you, as I said, 1-page outline for 4 books. All right. And you've got another asset which I forgot to mention, which I'll mention now because I'm looking at Jude. Now, what is Jude? I look here over at the book of Jude. The book of Jude is 25 verses. All right. You say, well, you've got the easy one. Yeah. Well, the reason I've got the easy one is because I want to spend 2 minutes doing this. That's all. Now, what the other element that I forgot to, I didn't forget, I haven't mentioned to you, is the fact that the Bible that you read it from has got its own titles over each section. Now, that's an outline. So that, for example, here's a commentary I have by Yarbrough, and on Jude, he says that this is the outline that he gives. He says, number 1, Roman numeral 1, salutation, verses 1 and 2. That means greetings and so on. Number 2, reasons for writing, verses 3 and 4. Number 3, Roman numeral 3, God's judgment in the past, verses 5 through 7. And then number 4, Roman numeral 4, warning against false teachers, 8 through 16. What else? Oh, and then a call to perseverance, number 5. All right. Now, if I look at the NIV, which I've got before me, the New International Version, what do they say? Well, they say a warning of history to the ungodly. And then keep yourselves in the love of God. So you can see now. You see what I'm saying here is the big picture. The big picture. So all I'm saying to you, and the hardest I'd say will be the laborious one will be Hebrews, because you've got to read 13 chapters. But if you read 13 chapters and you just, for each chapter, what comes to your mind, what is this chapter about? You don't have to worry about the details. Don't worry about that. But just what is this major? And then you write down 13 phrases or words that come to your mind, and then you put them together in an outline. Remember, we don't want declarative sentences that go on for a paragraph. We want an outline. Okay, so that will be required by the end of the week. Well, I think that's it for an introduction. We'll see how we go. Thanks very much.